The Dawn-Breakers, Nabil's narrative of the early days of the Bahá'í revelation, translated from the original Persian by Shoghi Effendi. This book has been recorded for the use of the handicapped by the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United Kingdom, 27 Rutland Gate, London SW7. Read by Ian Yeoman. This book is dedicated by Shoghi Effendi as follows. To the greatest holy leaf, the last survivor of a glorious and heroic age, I dedicate this work in token of a great debt of gratitude and love. It consists of an introduction, Nabil's preface, 2 parts, and an epilogue, and concludes with Baha'u'llah's tribute to the Bab and his chief disciples. The 2 parts are of unequal length. The first is entitled Pre-Revelation Days, and the second longer part is entitled The Revelation of the Bab. The Dawn-Breakers, Nabil's narrative, translated by Shoghi Effendi, for the handicapped. Tape 1. The Baha'i movement is now well known throughout the world, and the time has come when Nabil's unique narrative of its beginnings in darkest Persia will interest many readers. The record which he sets down with such devoted care is in many respects extraordinary. It has its thrilling passages, and the splendor of the central theme gives to the chronicle not only great historical value but high moral power. Its lights are strong, and this effect is more intense because they seem like a sunburst at midnight. The tale is one of struggle and martyrdom. Its poignant scenes, its tragic incidents are many. Corruption, fanaticism, and cruelty gather against the cause of reformation to destroy it, and the present volume closes at the point where a riot of hate seems to have accomplished its purpose and to have driven into exile or put to death every man, woman, and child in Persia who dared to profess a leaning towards the teachings of the Bab. Nabil, himself a participant in some of the scenes which he recites, took up his lonely pen to recite the truth about men and women so mercilessly persecuted and a movement so grievously traduced. He writes with ease, and when his emotions are strongly stirred, his style becomes vigorous and trenchant. He does not present with any system the claims and teaching of Baha'u'llah and his forerunner. His purpose is the simple one of rehearsing the beginnings of the Baha'i revelation and of preserving the remembrance of the deeds of its early champions. He relates a series of incidents, punctiliously quoting his authority for almost every item of information. His work, in consequence, if less artistic and philosophic, gains in value as a literal account of what we knew or could from credible witnesses discover about the early history of the cause. The main features of the narrative, the saintly heroic figure of the Bab, a leader so mild and so serene, yet eager, resolute, and dominant, the devotion of his followers facing oppression with unbroken courage and often with ecstasy, the rage of a jealous priesthood inflaming for its own purpose the passions of a bloodthirsty populace. These speak a language which all may understand. But it is not easy to follow the narrative in its details, or to appreciate how stupendous was the task undertaken by Baha'u'llah and his forerunner, without some knowledge of the condition of church and state in Persia, and of the customs and mental outlook of the people and their masters. Nabil took his knowledge for granted. He had himself travelled little, if at all, beyond the boundary of the empires of the Shah and of the Sultan, and it did not occur to him to institute comparisons between his own and foreign civilizations. He was not addressing the Western reader, though he was conscious that the material he had collected was of more than national or Islamic importance, and that it would before long spread both eastward and westward until it encircled the globe. Yet he was an Oriental writing in an Oriental language for those who used it, and the unique work which he so faithfully accomplished was in itself a great and laborious task. There exists in English, however, a literature about Persia in the 19th century which will give the Western reader ample information on the subject. From Persian writings, which have already been translated, or from books of European travellers like Lord Curzon, Sir J. Malcolm, and others not a few, he will find a lifelike and vivid if unlovely picture of the Augean conditions which the Bab had to confront when he inaugurated the movement in the middle of the 19th century. All observers agree in representing Persia as a feeble and backward nation divided against itself by corrupt practices and ferocious bigotries. Inefficiency and wretchedness, the fruit of moral decay, filled the land. From the highest to the lowest, there appeared neither the capacity to carry out methods of reform, nor even the will seriously to institute them. National conceit preached a grandiose self-content. A pall of immobility lay over all things, and a general paralysis of mind made any development impossible. To a student of history, the degeneracy of a nation once so powerful and so illustrious seems pitiful in the extreme. Abdul-Baha, who in spite of the cruelties heaped on Baha'u'llah, on the Bab, and on himself, yet loved his country, called their degradation the tragedy of a people. And in that work, The Mysterious Forces of Civilization, in which he sought to stir the hearts of his compatriots to undertake radical reforms, he uttered a poignant lament over the present fate of a people who once had extended their conquests east and west, and had led the civilization of mankind. In former times, he writes, Persia was verily the heart of the world, and shone among the nations like a lighted taper. Her glory and prosperity broke from the horizon of humanity like the true dawn disseminating the light of knowledge and illuminating the nations of the east and west. The fame of her victorious kings reached the ears of the dwellers at the poles of the earth. The majesty of her King of Kings humbled the monarchs of Greece and Rome. Her governing wisdom filled the sages with awe, and the rulers of the continents fashioned their laws upon her polity. The Persians, being distinguished among the nations of the earth as a people of conquerors and justly admired for their civilization and learning, their country became the glorious center of all the sciences and arts, the mine of culture, and the fount of virtues. How is it that this excellent country now, by reason of our sloth, vanity, and indifference, from the lack of knowledge and organization, from the poverty of the zeal and ambition of her people, has suffered the rays of her prosperity to be darkened and well nigh extinguished? Other writers describe fully those unhappy conditions to which Abdul-Baha refers. At the time when the Bab declared his mission, the government of the country was, in Lord Curzon's phrase, a church state. Venal, cruel, and immoral as it was formally religious. Muslim orthodoxy was its basis, and permeated to the core both it and the social lives of the people. But otherwise there were no laws, statutes, or charters to guide the direction of public affairs. There was no House of Lords, nor Privy Council, no Synod, no Parliament. The Shah was despot, and his arbitrary rule was reflected all down the official scale through every minister and governor to the lowliest clerk or remotest headman. No civil tribunal existed to check or modify the power of the monarch, or the authority which he might choose to delegate to his subordinates. If there was a law, it was his word. He could do as he pleased. It was his to appoint or to dismiss all ministers, officials, officers, and judges. He had power of life and death, without appeal, over all members of his household and of his court, whether civil or military. The right to take life was vested in him alone, and so were all the functions of government, legislative, executive, and judicial. His royal prerogative was limited by no written restraint whatever. The descendants of the Shahs were thrust into the most lucrative posts throughout the country, and as the generations went by, they filled innumerable minor posts too, far and wide, till the land was burdened with this race of royal drones who owed their position to nothing better than their blood, and who gave rise to the Persian saying that camels, fleas, and princes exist everywhere. Even when a Shah wished to make a just and wise decision in any case that might be brought before him for judgment, he found it difficult to do so, because he could not rely on the information given him. Critical facts would be withheld, or the facts would be distorted by the influence of interested witnesses or venal ministers. The system of corruption had been carried so far in Persia that it had become a recognized institution, which Lord Curzon describes in the following terms. I come now to that which is the cardinal and differentiating feature of Iranian administration. Government, nay, life itself in that country, may be said to consist for the most part of an interchange of presents. Under its social aspects, this practice may be supposed to illustrate the generous sentiments of an amiable people, though even here it has a grimly unemotional side, as for instance, when congratulating yourself upon being the recipient of a gift, you find that not only must you make a return of equivalent cost to the donor, but must also liberally remunerate the bearer of the gift, to whom your return is very likely the sole recognized means of subsistence, in a ratio proportionate to its pecuniary value. Under its political aspects, the practice of gift-making, though consecrated in the adamantine traditions of the East, is synonymous with a system elsewhere described by less agreeable names. This is the system on which the government of Persia has been conducted for centuries, and the maintenance of which opposes a solid barrier to any real reform. From the Shah downwards, there is scarcely an official who is not open to gifts, scarcely a post which has not been amassed by the receipt of gifts. Every individual, with hardly an exception, is the official hierarchy above mentioned, has only purchased his post by a money present either to the Shah or to the minister, or to the superior governor by whom he has been appointed. If there are several candidates for a post, in all probability the one who makes the best offer will win. The madakhil is a cherished national institution in Persia, the exaction of which, in a myriad different forms, whose ingenuity is only equalled by their multiplicity, is the crowning interest and delight of a Persian's existence. This remarkable word, for which Mr. Watson said there is no precise English equivalent, may be variously translated as commission, perquisite, douceur, consideration, pickings and stealings, profit, according to the immediate context in which it is employed. Roughly speaking, it signifies that balance of personal advantage, usually expressed in money form, which can be squeezed out of any and every transaction. A negotiation in which two parties are involved as donor and recipient, as superior and subordinate, or even as equal contracting agents, cannot take place in Persia without the party who can be represented as the author of the favor or service claiming and receiving a definite cash return for what he has done or given. It may of course be said that human nature is much the same all the world over, that a similar system exists under a different name in our own or other countries, and that the philosophic critic will welcome in the Persian a man and a brother. To some extent this is true, but in no country that I have ever seen or heard of in the world is the system so open, so shameless, or so universal as in Persia. So far from being limited to the sphere of domestic economy or to commercial transactions, it permeates every walk and inspires most of the actions of life. By its operation, generosity or gratuitous service may be said to have been erased in Persia from the category of social virtues, and cupidity has been elevated into the guiding principle of human conduct. Hereby is instituted an arithmetical progression of plunder from the sovereign to the subject, each unit in the descending scale remunerating himself from the unit next in rank below his, and the hapless peasant being the ultimate victim. It is not surprising under these circumstances that office is the common avenue to wealth, and that cases are frequent of men who, having started from nothing, are found residing in magnificent houses, surrounded by crowds of retainers and living in princely style. Make what you can while you can is the rule that most men set before themselves in entering public life. Nor does the popular spirit resent the act, the estimation of anyone who, enjoying the opportunity, has failed to line his own pockets, being the reverse of complimentary to his sense. No one turns a thought to the sufferers from whom, in the last resort, the material for these successive madakhils has been derived, and from the sweat of whose uncomplaining brow has been wrung the wealth that is dissipated in luxurious country houses, European curiosities, and enormous retinues. To read the foregoing is to perceive something of the difficulty of the Bab's mission. To read the following is to understand the dangers he faced, and to be prepared for a story of violence and heinous cruelty. Before I quit the subject of the Persian law and its administration, let me add a few words upon the subject of penalties and prisons. Nothing is more shocking to the European reader in pursuing his way through the crime-stained and bloody pages of Persian history during the last and, in a happily less degree during the present century than the record of savage punishments and abominable tortures, testifying alternately to the callousness of the brute and the ingenuity of the fiend. The Persian character has ever been fertile in device and indifferent to suffering, and in the field of judicial executions it has found ample scope for the exercise of both attainments. Up till quite a recent period, well within the borders of the present reign, condemned criminals have been crucified, blown from guns, buried alive, impaled, shod like horses, torn asunder by being bound to the heads of two trees, bent together and then allowed to spring back to their natural position, converted into human torches, flayed while living. Under a twofold governing system, such as that of which I have now completed the description, namely an administration in which every actor is, in different aspects, both the briber and the bribed, and a judicial procedure without either a law or a law court, it will readily be understood that confidence in the government is not likely to exist, that there is no personal sense of duty or pride of honor, no mutual trust or cooperation, except in the service of ill-doing, no disgrace in exposure, no credit in virtue, above all, no national spirit or patriotism. From the beginning, the Bab must have divined the reception which would be accorded by his countrymen to his teachings, and the fate which awaited him at the hands of the mullahs. But he did not allow personal misgivings to affect the frank enunciation of his claims, nor the open presentation of his cause. The innovations which he proclaimed, though purely religious, were drastic, the announcement of his own identity startling and tremendous. He made himself known as the Qaim, the High Prophet, or Messiah so long promised, so eagerly expected by the Mohammedan world. He added to this the declaration that he was also the gate, that is, the Bab, through whom a greater manifestation than himself was to enter the human realm. Putting himself thus in line with the traditions of Islam, and appearing as the fulfillment of prophecy, he came into conflict with those who had fixed the ineradicable ideas, different from his, as to what those prophecies and traditions meant. The two great Persian sects of Islam, the Shia and the Sunnis, both attached vital importance to the ancient deposit of their faith, but did not agree as to its contents or its imports. The Shias, out of whose doctrines the Bábí movement arose, held that after the ascension of the High Prophet Muhammad, he was succeeded by a line of 12 Imams. Each of these, they held, was specially endowed by God with spiritual gifts and powers, and was entitled to the wholehearted obedience of the faithful. Each owed his appointment not to the popular choice, but to his nomination by his predecessor in office. The 12th and last of these inspired guides was Muhammad, called by the Shias Imam Mihdi, Hujjatullah, the proof of God, Baqiyatullah, the remnant of God, and Qaim-i Muhammad, he who shall arise of the family of Muhammad. He assumed the functions of the Imam in the year 260 of the Hegira, but at once disappeared from view and communicated with his followers only through a certain chosen intermediary known as a gate. 4 of these gates followed one another in order, each appointed by his predecessor with the approval of the Imam. But when the 4th, Abul Hasan Ali, was asked by the faithful before he died to name his successor, he declined to do so. He said that God had another plan. On his death, all communication between the Imam and his church therefore ceased, and though, surrounded by a band of followers, he still lives and waits in some mysterious retreat, he will not resume relations with his people until he comes forth in power to establish a millennium throughout the world. The Sunnis, on the other hand, take a less exalted view of the office of those who have succeeded the High Prophet. They regard the vice-regency less as a spiritual than as a practical matter. The Caliph is, in their eyes, the defender of the faith, and he owes his appointment to the choice and approval of the people. Important as these differences are, both sects agree, however, in expecting a twofold manifestation. The Shias look for the Qaim, who is to come in the fullness of time, and also for the return of the Imam Hussein. The Sunnis await the appearance of the Mihdi, and also the return of Jesus Christ. When, at the beginning of his mission, The Bab, continuing the tradition of the Shias, proclaimed his function under the double title of first the Qaim and second the Gate or Bab. Some of the Mohammedans misunderstood the latter reference. They imagined his meaning to be that he was a fifth gate in succession to Abul Hassan Ali. His true meaning, however, as he himself clearly announced, was very different. He was the Qaim, but the Qaim, though a high prophet, stood in relation to a succeeding and greater manifestation, as did John the Baptist to Christ. He was the forerunner of one yet more mighty than himself. He was to decrease, that mighty one was to increase. And as John the Baptist had been the herald or gate of the Christ, so was the Bab the herald or gate of Baha'u'llah. There are many authentic traditions showing that the Qaim, on his appearance, would bring new laws with him, and would thus abrogate Islam. But this was not the understanding of the established hierarchy. They confidently expected that the promised advent would not substitute a new and richer revelation for the old, but would endorse and fortify the system of which they were the functionaries. It would enhance incalculably their personal prestige, would extend their authority far and wide among the nations, and would win for them the reluctant but abject homage of mankind. When the Bab revealed his Bayan, proclaimed a new code of religious law, and by precept and example instituted a profound moral and spiritual reform, the priests immediately scented mortal danger. They saw their monopoly undermined, their ambition threatened, their own lives and conduct put to shame. They rose against him in sanctimonious indignation. They declared before the Shah and all the people that this upstart was an enemy of sound learning, a subverter of Islam, a traitor to Muhammad, and a peril not only to the Holy Church, but to the social order and to the state itself. The cause of the rejection and persecution of the Bab was in its essence the same as that of the rejection and persecution of the Christ. If Jesus had not brought a new book, if he had not only reiterated the spiritual principles taught by Moses, but had continued Moses' rules and regulations too, he might, as a merely moral reformer, have escaped the vengeance of the scribes and the Pharisees. But to claim that any part of the Mosaic law, even such material ordinances as those that dealt with divorce and the keeping of the Sabbath, could be altered, and altered by an unordained preacher from the village of Nazareth, this was to threaten the interests of the scribes and Pharisees themselves, and since they were the representatives of Moses and of God, it was blasphemy against the Most High. As soon as the position of Jesus was understood, his persecution began. As he refused to desist, he was put to death. For reasons exactly parallel, the Bab was from the beginning opposed by the vested interests of the dominant church as an uprooter of the faith. Yet even in that dark and fanatical country, the mullahs, like the scribes in Palestine 18 centuries before, did not find it very easy to put forward a plausible pretext for destroying him whom they thought their enemy. The only known record of the Bab's having been seen by a European belongs to the period of his persecution, when an English physician resident in Tabriz, Dr. Cormick, was called in by the Persian authorities to pronounce on the Bab's mental condition. The doctor's letter, addressed to a fellow practitioner in an American mission in Persia, is given in Professor E.G. Brown's Materials for the Study of the Bábí Religion. "You ask me," writes the doctor, "for some particulars of my interview with the founder of the sect known as Bábís. Nothing of any importance transpired in this interview, as the Bab was aware of my having been sent with 2 other Persian doctors to see whether he was of sane mind or merely a madman, to decide the question whether he was to be put to death or not. With this knowledge, he was loath to answer any questions put to him. To all inquiries he merely regarded us with a mild look, chanting in a low melodious voice some hymns, I suppose. 2 other Seeds, his intimate friends, were also present, who subsequently were put to death with him, besides a couple of government officials. He only deigned to answer me on my saying that I was not a Mussulman and was willing to know something about his religion, as I might perhaps be inclined to adopt it. He regarded me very intently on my saying this, and replied that he had no doubt of all Europeans coming over to his religion. Our report to the Shah at that time was of a nature to spare his life. He was put to death some time after by the order of the Amir Nizam Mirza Taqi Khan. On our report, he merely got the bastinado, in which operation a Farash, whether intentionally or not, struck him across the face with the stick destined for his feet, which produced a great wound and swelling of the face. On being asked whether a Persian surgeon should be brought to treat him, he expressed a desire that I should be sent for, and I accordingly treated him for a few days. But in the interviews consequent on this, I could never get him to have a confidential chat with me, as some government people were always present, he being a prisoner. He was a very mild and delicate-looking man, rather small in stature, and very fair for a Persian, with a melodious, soft voice which struck me much. Being a Cid, he was dressed in the habit of that sect, as were also his two companions. In fact, his whole look and deportment went far to dispose one in his favour. Of his doctrine I heard nothing from his own lips, although the idea was that there existed in his religion a certain approach to Christianity. He was seen by some Armenian carpenters, who were sent to make some repairs in his prison, reading the Bible, and he took no pains to conceal it, but on the contrary told them of it. Most assuredly, the Mussulman fanaticism does not exist in his religion, as applied to Christians, nor is there that restraint of females that now exists. Such was the impression made by the Bab upon a cultivated Englishman, and as far as the influence of his character and teaching have since spread through the West, no other record is extant of his having been observed or seen by European eyes. His qualities were so rare in their nobility and beauty, his personality so gentle and yet so forceful, and his natural charm was combined with so much tact and judgment that after his declaration he quickly became in Persia a widely popular figure. He would win over almost all with whom he was brought into personal contact, often converting his jailers to his faith and turning the ill-disposed into admiring friends. To silence such a man without incurring some degree of public odium was not very easy, even in the Persia of the middle of the last century. But with the Bab's followers it was another matter. The mullahs encountered here no cause for delay and found little need for scheming. The bigotry of the Mohammedans from the Shah downwards could be readily roused against any religious development. The Babis could be accused of disloyalty to the Shah, and dark political motives could be attributed to their activities. Moreover, the Bab's followers were already numerous. Many of them were well-to-do, some were rich, and there were few but had some possessions which covetous neighbors might be instigated to desire. Appealing to the fears of the authorities and to the base national passions of fanaticism and cupidity, the mullahs inaugurated a campaign of outrage and spoliation, which they maintained with relentless ferocity till they considered that their purpose had been completely achieved. Many of the incidents of this unhappy story are given by Nabil in his history, and among these the happenings at Mazindaran, Neriz, and Zanjan stand out by reason of the character of the episodes of the heroism of the Babis when thus brought to bay. On these three occasions a number of Babis, driven to desperation, withdrew in concert from their houses to a chosen retreat and, erecting defensive works about them, defied in arms further pursuit. To any impartial witness, it was evident that the mullah's allegations of a political motive were untrue. The Babis showed themselves always ready, on an assurance that they would be no longer molested for their religious beliefs, to return peacefully to their civil occupations. Nabil emphasizes their care to refrain from aggression. They would fight for their lives with determined skill and strength, but they would not attack. Even in the midst of a fierce conflict, they would not drive home an advantage, nor strike an unnecessary blow. Abdul-Baha is quoted in the Traveller's Narrative, pages 34 to 35, as making the following statement on the moral aspect of their action. The minister, Mirza Taqi Khan, with the utmost arbitrariness, without receiving any instructions or asking permission, sent forth commands in all directions to punish and chastise the Babis. Governors and magistrates sought a pretext for amassing wealth, and officials a means of acquiring profits. Celebrated doctors from the summits of their pulpits incited men to make a general onslaught. The powers of the religious and the civil law linked hands and strove to eradicate and destroy this people. Now this people had not yet acquired such knowledge as was right and needful of the fundamental principles and hidden doctrines of the Bab's teachings, and did not recognize their duties. Their conceptions and ideas were after the former fashion, and their conduct and behavior in correspondence with ancient usage. The way of approach to the Bab was, moreover, closed, and the flame of trouble visibly blazing on every side. At the decree of the most celebrated doctors, the government, and indeed the common people, had with irresistible power inaugurated rapine and plunder on all sides, and were engaged in punishing and torturing, killing and despoiling, in order that they might quench this fire and wither these poor souls. In towns where there were but a limited number, all of them with bound hands became food for the sword, while in the cities, where they were numerous, they arose in self-defense in accordance with their former beliefs, since it was impossible for them to make inquiry as to their duty, and all doors were closed. Baha'u'llah, on proclaiming some years later his mission, left no room for uncertainty as to the law of his dispensation in such a predicament, when he affirmed, "It is better to be killed than to kill." Whatever resistance the Babis offered, here or elsewhere, proved ineffective. They were overwhelmed by numbers. The Bab himself was taken from his cell and executed. Of his chief disciples, who avowed their belief in him, not one soul was left alive save Baha'u'llah, who with his family and a handful of devoted followers was driven destitute into exile and prison in a foreign land. But the fire, though smothered, was not quenched. It burned in the hearts of the exiles who carried it from country to country as they traveled. Even in the homeland of Persia, it had penetrated too deeply to be extinguished by physical violence, and still smoldered in the people's hearts, needing only a breath from the spirit to be fanned into an all-consuming conflagration. The second and greater manifestation of God was proclaimed in accordance with the prophecy of the Bab at the date which he had foretold. 9 years after the beginning of the Babi dispensation, that is, in 1853, Baha'u'llah, in certain of his odes, alluded to his identity and his mission, and 10 years later, while resident in Baghdad, declared himself as the promised one to his companions. Now the great movement for which the Bab had prepared the way began to show the full range and magnificence of its power. Though Baha'u'llah himself lived and died in exile and a prisoner, and was known to few Europeans, his epistles proclaiming the new advent were borne to the great rulers of both hemispheres, from the Shah of Persia to the Pope, and to the President of the United States. After his passing, his son Abdul-Baha carried the tidings in person into Egypt and far through the Western world. Abdul-Baha visited England, France, Switzerland, Germany, and America, announcing everywhere that once again the heavens had opened and that a new dispensation had come to bless the sons of men. He died in November 1921, and today the fire that once seemed to have been put out forever burns again in every part of Persia, has established itself on the American continent, and has laid hold of every country in the world. Around the sacred writings of Baha'u'llah and the authoritative exposition of Abdul-Baha, there is growing a large volume of literature in comment or in witness, the humanitarian and spiritual principles enunciated decades ago in the darkest East by Baha'u'llah and molded by him into a coherent scheme, are one after the other being taken by a world unconscious of their source as the marks of progressive civilization. And the sense that mankind has broken with the past, and that the old guidance will not carry it through the emergencies of the present, has filled with uncertainty and dismay all thoughtful men save those who have learned to find in the story of Baha'u'llah the meaning of all the prodigies and portents of our time. Nearly 3 generations have passed since the inception of the movement. Any of its early adherents who escaped the sword and the stake have long since passed away in the course of nature. The door of contemporary information as to its great leaders and their heroic disciples is closed forever. The chronicle of Nabil, as a careful collection of facts made in the interests of truth and completed in the lifetime of Baha'u'llah, has now a unique value. The author was 13 years old when the Bab declared himself, having been born in the village of Zarand in Persia on the 18th day of Safar, AH 1247. He was throughout his life closely associated with the leaders of the cause. Though he was but a boy at the time, he was preparing to leave for Sheikh Tabasi and joined the party of Mullah Hussein when the news of the treacherous massacre of the Babis frustrated his design. He states in his narrative that he met in Tehran Haji Mirza Syed Ali, a brother of the Bab's mother, who had just returned at the time from visiting the Bab in the fortress of Shirik, and for many years he was a close companion of the Bab's secretary, Mirza Ahmad. He entered the presence of Baha'u'llah in Kermanshah and Tehran before the date of the exile to Iraq, and afterwards was in attendance upon him in Baghdad and Adrianople, as well as in the prison city of Akka. He was sent more than once on missions to Persia to promote the cause and to encourage the scattered and persecuted believers, and he was living in Akka when Baha'u'llah passed away in AD 1892. The manner of his death was pathetic and lamentable, for he became so dreadfully affected by the death of the great beloved that, overmastered by grief, he drowned himself in the sea, and his dead body was found washed ashore near the city of Akka. His chronicle was begun in 1888, when he had the personal assistance of Mirza Musa, the brother of Baha'u'llah. It was finished in about a year and a half, and parts of the manuscripts were reviewed and approved, some by Baha'u'llah and others by Abdul-Baha. The complete work carries the history of the movement up to the death of Baha'u'llah in 1892. The first half of this narrative, closing with the expulsion of Baha'u'llah from Persia, is contained in the present volume. Its importance is evident. It will be read less for the stirring passages of action which it contains, or even for its many pictures of heroism and unwavering faith, than for the abiding significance of those events of which it gives so unique a record. Part 1. Pre-Revelation Days. Chapter 1. The Mission of Sheikh Ahmad-i-Asai. At a time when the shining reality of the faith of Muhammad had been obscured by the ignorance, the fanaticism, and perversity of the contending sects into which it had fallen, there appeared above the horizon of the East that luminous star of divine guidance, Sheikh Ahmad-i-Asai. He observed how those who professed the faith of Islam had shattered its unity, sapped its force, perverted its purpose, and degraded its holy name. His soul was filled with anguish at the sight of the corruption and strife which characterized the Shia sect of Islam. Inspired by the light that shone within him, he arose with unerring vision, with fixed purpose and sublime detachment to utter his protest against the betrayal of the faith by that ignoble people. Aglow with zeal and conscious of the sublimity of his calling, he vehemently appealed not only to Shia Islam, but to all the followers of Muhammad throughout the East, to awaken from the slumber of negligence, and to prepare the way for him who must needs be made manifest in the fullness of time, whose light alone could dissipate the mists of prejudice and ignorance which had enveloped that faith. Forsaking his home and kindred, on one of the islands of Bahrain to the south of the Persian Gulf, he set out, as bidden by an almighty providence, to unravel the mysteries of those verses of Islamic scriptures which foreshadowed the advent of a new manifestation. He was well aware of the dangers and perils that beset his path. He fully realized the crushing responsibility of his task. There burned in his soul the conviction that no reform, however drastic, within the faith of Islam could achieve the regeneration of this perverse people. He knew and was destined by the will of God to demonstrate that nothing short of a new and independent revelation, as attested and foreshadowed by the sacred scriptures of Islam, could revive the fortunes and restore the purity of that decadent faith. Bereft of all earthly possessions and detached from all save God, he, in the early days of the 13th century of the Hegira, when 40 years of age, arose to dedicate the remaining days of his life to the task he felt impelled to shoulder. He first proceeded to Najaf and Karbala, where in a few years he acquired familiarity with the prevailing thoughts and standards current among the learned men of Islam. There he came to be recognized as one of the authorized expounders of the Islamic Holy Writ, was declared a mujtahid, and soon obtained an ascendancy over the rest of his colleagues, who either visited or were residing in the holy cities. These came to regard him as one initiated into the mysteries of divine revelation, and qualified to unravel the abstruse utterances of Muhammad and of the Imams of the faith. As his influence increased, and the scope of his authority widened, he found himself besieged on every side by an ever-increasing number of devoted inquirers who asked to be enlightened regarding the intricacies of the faith, all of which he ably and fully expounded. By his knowledge and fearlessness he struck terror to the hearts of the Sufis and Neoplatonists and other kindred schools of thought who envied his learning and feared his ruthlessness. There is a footnote here. The chief peculiarities of Sheikh Ahmad's views seem to have been as follows. He declared that all knowledge and all sciences were contained in the Quran, and that therefore to understand the inner meanings of the latter in their entirety, the knowledge of the former must be acquired. To develop this doctrine, he used to apply Kabbalistic methods of interpretation to the sacred text, and exerted himself to acquire familiarity with the various sciences known to the Muslim world. He entertained the most exaggerated veneration for the Imams, especially the Imam Ja'far Sadiq, the sixth of them in succession, whose words he would often quote. About the future life and the resurrection of the body also, he held views which are generally considered to be heterodox, as previously mentioned. He declared that the body was composed of different portions, derived from each of the 4 elements and the 9 heavens, and that the body wherewith he was raised in the resurrection contained only the latter components, the former returning at death to their original sources. This subtle body, which alone escaped destruction, he called Jism-i Hurakliya, the latter being supposed to be a Greek word. He asserted that it existed potentially in our present bodies like glass in stone. Similarly, he asserted that, in the case of the night ascent of the Prophet to heaven, it was this, and not his material body, which performed the journey. On account of these views, he was pronounced unorthodox by the majority of ulamas, and accused of holding the doctrines of Mulla Sadra, the greatest Persian philosopher of the times. Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, 1889, Article 12, pages 890 to 891. Thereby he acquired added favor in the eyes of those learned divines who looked upon these sects as the disseminators of obscure and heretical doctrines. Yet great as was his fame and universal as was the esteem in which he was regarded, he despised all the honors which his admirers lavished upon him. He marveled at their servile devotion to dignity and rank, and refused resolutely to associate himself with the objects of their pursuits and desires. Having achieved his purpose in those cities, and inhaling the fragrance which wafted upon him from Persia, he felt in his heart an irresistible yearning to hasten to that country. He concealed from his friends, however, the real motive that impelled him to direct his steps towards that land. By way of the Persian Gulf, he hastened into the land of his heart's desire, ostensibly for the purpose of visiting the shrine of the Imam Rida in Mashhad. He was filled with eagerness to unburden his soul, and searched zealously for those to whom he could deliver the secret, which to no one he had as yet divulged. Upon his arrival in Shiraz, the city which enshrined that concealed treasure of God, and from which the voice of the herald of a new manifestation was destined to be proclaimed, he repaired to the Masjid-i-Jumi, a mosque in which, in its style and shape, bore a striking resemblance to the holy shrine of Mecca. Many a time did he, whilst gazing upon that edifice, observe, "Verily this house of God betokens such signs as only those who are endowed with understanding can perceive. Methinks he who conceived and built it was inspired of God." There is a footnote here. In the country of Fars, there is a mosque in the center of which rises a structure similar to the Kabe, which is the Masjid-i-Jumi. It was built only as a sign indicating the manifestation of the will of God through the erection of a house in this land. Allusion to the new Mecca, i.e. the house of the Bab in Shiraz. Blessed be he who worships God in that land. Truly, we too worship God there, and prayed for him who had erected that building. How often and how passionately he extolled that city. Such was the praise he lavished upon it, that his hearers, who were only too familiar with its mediocrity, were astonished at the tone of his language.